All right, I want to welcome those joining us online and joining us here in the room at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. This is your first time joining us for our Sustainable Energy Seminar. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Research and Education Coordinator here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And the Sustainable Energy Seminar is something that we do every other week, Mondays at 3:30, both in the fall and the spring semesters, with the goal of bringing in researchers and experts on campus who are understanding sustainable energy challenges and developing solutions from a number of different disciplines. So throughout this series, you'll hear from folks in science and engineering, social sciences, humanities, policy, and today we have a professor from the law school giving our presentation today. In addition to this being a public seminar, this is a class for students in the undergraduate certificate in engineering for energy sustainability, as well as the master's in sustainable systems engineering. If you're online, please use the Q&A box to ask any questions, and I'll be monitoring the online questions, and we'll try to alternate between in-person and online questions here. We do have live captioning available. I'll turn that feature on. For those online, you can just click show captions if you would like to have live transcription. And our guest speaker today is Sumudu Atapattu, who's a teaching professor and the director of the Global Legal Studies Center at the UW Law School. She's also the executive director of the Human Rights Program at UW-Madison. And her teaching and research deal with international environmental law and climate change and human rights, which she'll speak about today, as well as in the context of sustainable energy. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Scott, for inviting me. I don't know whether the online participants can hear me.
They should be able to.
They should be able to. Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming here today. So I'm going to talk to you about, how do I slideshow? All right.
Might take a second to talk to you.
Okay.
There we go.
Did not.
I wonder if you need to download it, like not do it through the browser, but or another way you can hear. Maybe I'll help you share your screen.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Great. All right, technology. Okay, it's not.
Can you? It might take it just a split second.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about this technology. Okay, and how long should I plan to speak for?
About 45 minutes.
Okay. All right. So today we are going to talk about climate change, sustainable energy, and human rights. I'm not an energy expert, so bear with me, but I'm going to talk about energy in the context of climate change and the link with human rights. So this is the summary. We know that one of the main causes of climate change is use of energy, right? Especially use of fossil fuels. So transitioning to sustainable energy or renewable energy, I'm going to use the term interchangeably. I know for energy experts, there is a distinction. So maybe some of you can teach me about that, but so transitioning to sustainable energy is necessary, but when we do that, it's important also to bear the human rights impact of this transition. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So everybody probably knows who this is. Yeah, students? Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, the UN Secretary General, who is knee deep in water trying to show the future we are facing, right? So to take a step back and look at where we are right now, I'm pretty sure you guys know all about this, but sometimes it helps to sort of put this in context, right? So we know it's a global problem, right? So every state, every country in the world, and all of us are contributing to the problem, right? But of course, that's a very simplified way of putting it. Not every state is contributing equally. Not each of us is contributing equally either, right? And when we look at the impacts, there's a disproportionate impact on those who contributed least to the problem. So this raises justice issues, right? Those who contributed most to the problem are not those who will suffer the consequences the most, right? So in other words, there's an inverse relationship between contribution and consequences, right? Unfortunately, those who are already in a vulnerable situation will suffer the consequences most, right? So that's where the justice and human rights framework come in handy, right? We know right now China is the biggest contributor to climate change, but United States is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution, right? So our responsibility is pretty big, right? So, and in terms of per capita emissions, our contribution is pretty high as well, right? So according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because of the emissions that are already there, we cannot avoid some of the devastating impacts, and we are living through some of them, right? Every day there is some catastrophe or other in the news, right? Some flooding, wildfires, etc. There's still a narrow window to keep the situation from worsening, right? But we have locked in about 30 years of climate impacts, right? So according to the scientists, we have emitted so much greenhouse gas emissions that warming will continue until the middle of the century, right? Even if we drastically reduce our emissions. And many of the consequences we see today will worsen, unfortunately, for the next 30 years. Other impacts will continue longer, like glacial melt and global sea level rise, right? And the other unfortunate thing is that these impacts are happening faster than we expected, right? So what does this mean for us? We have to learn to live with these consequences. In other words, to adapt to these consequences. And it's not just us, human beings, that are suffering. Animals, biodiversity, etc., are affected as well, right? And the other unfortunate impact is that some communities will have to be relocated permanently, right? And that is also happening right now, right? Right here in the United States, some communities are awaiting relocation. There are several indigenous communities in Alaska that are awaiting relocation. And another indigenous community on an island close to Louisiana is being relocated right now. So this is the emissions gap report that the United Nations Environment Program publishes every year. So it looks at what is promised and what's needed. So states have made commitments under the Paris Agreement to reduce their emissions by certain percentages. And even if we add up all those commitments, there's still a huge gap between what we have promised and where we need to be, right? So this report said we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 45%, almost half, by 2030, and we need to go carbon neutral by 2050, right? Sorry about those boxes there. But unfortunately, there was a report just last week which said that these consequences are happening way faster than the scientists predicted. And if we are serious about reaching, not exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the safe threshold that scientists have said, we have to go carbon neutral by 2034. Think about it. Within 10 years, we have to go carbon neutral, right? So it's not a very promising picture, unfortunately. So if you look at the impacts on people, I mean, the impact is pretty drastic, right? There will be water shortages, food scarcity, and some of these consequences are happening already. Land degradation and desertification, health impacts, looking at vector-borne diseases like malaria, which we haven't seen in temperate countries. The frequency and intensity of extreme weather events will increase, right? Sea levels are rising, as we know. And water is getting more salty because of all the, well, one of the issues that I read very recently is that even soils are getting saltier because of all the salt we are putting on our roads, because of saltwater intrusion into many of the small island states, for example. Drinking water is getting salty, there's salinity, so that's affecting agriculture, all that. Wildfires are increasing, with that destruction of lives and property. Mass displacement, I spoke about the need to relocate people, but people will be displaced, forcibly displaced as well. And many believe that conflict will increase as a result of climate change, which means that there will be less resources like water and food. And the estimates of those who will be displaced range between 20 million to 200 million by 2050 or 2030. Of course, climate change is not the only driver of migration and displacement, so these numbers have been critiqued a bit, but whatever the numbers are, it's likely to be in the millions. So this is another big issue we are facing. And permanent relocation of people. And here we are talking about small island states that might become permanently submerged due to sea level rise and severe weather events. Some islands are already becoming uninhabitable. So we are already witnessing the adverse impacts on people. So some pictures. British Columbia saw its highest temperatures a couple of years ago, and this year, as you would have read, is the highest, warmest year on record, right? Some more pictures from around the world. Floods in Pakistan last year, which affected millions of people. Heat wave in South Asia last year. The temperatures went above 112 degrees Fahrenheit in India. So this report was actually compiled by the World Commission on Environment and Development at the request of the UN General Assembly in 1987. And it looked at the link between poverty, injustice, environmental degradation, and conflict, and said that states spend far more on, even impoverished ones, spend far more money on military expenditure than on social programs. And they spend far more to protect their people from invading armies than from the invading desert, right? So environmental degradation has a huge impact, not just on people's lives, but also on the economy as well. Bushfires in Australia a couple of years ago, Hurricane Maria, and more recently, Hurricane Ian. I mean, unfortunately, the list goes on, right? We saw wildfires in Hawaii recently. So imagine rebuilding your life after something like this, if you survive, right? And this is the community that is being relocated, called America's First Climate Refugees. They did get a federal grant to relocate the community, but many communities in Alaska haven't received adequate funding or a place to go to, so they are awaiting relocation right now. And many of them are indigenous, as I mentioned. For them, land is important, right? Their culture is intertwined with the land they live, so where they will relocate to is questionable. So this is Mary Robinson, who said climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century, right? Because of the impact on people. But despite this link, the human rights community didn't really look at the link between climate change and human rights until quite recently, actually. So the first resolution by the Human Rights Council was in 2008, and it requested the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights to prepare a report on the link between climate change and human rights, right? And that was in 2009, and the report said almost all protected rights could be affected by climate change. And more recently, the Human Rights Council created a mandate for a special rapporteur to study the link between climate change and human rights. There was a lot of lobbying by human rights groups as well as environmental groups to create this special mandate, right? So states have already accepted human rights obligations, whether climate change is mentioned or not, and meaning none of them do actually. States have to comply with the human rights obligations that they have already accepted, right? And as we saw, climate change poses a huge risk to the enjoyment of rights, starting with right to life, actually, because so many have died as a result of these severe weather events. So states have to protect people from these consequences. So I mentioned that at the beginning that although this is a global problem, not everybody is contributing to the same in the same manner, or not everybody is affected in the same manner, right? So The unfortunate thing about climate change is that due to historic marginalization, sometimes social norms and other vulnerabilities, and even geography, as we saw, some groups and states are more susceptible to climate change consequences than others, right? So these groups include women. In many societies, we know that women go to fetch water, firewood. So when there's less water, they have to walk longer distances to collect water. And as a result, they may be vulnerable to harassment and violence, etc. Children, another group. We talked about indigenous peoples, the elderly, poor people, refugees, people with disabilities, minorities. So these are people, or these are groups that are already in a vulnerable situation, and they will be disproportionately affected by climate change, right? And these vulnerabilities also intersect with one another, right? So a poor woman, a poor minority woman will be much more susceptible to these consequences than a woman from the majority, right? Refugee women or indigenous women will be much more susceptible to these consequences than a man from majority, for example, right? So intersectionality becomes an important lens to study the impact on these groups, right? And in addition to these groups, there are vulnerable countries as well. I mentioned small island states. There are about 50 of them that will be disproportionately affected to the extent of completely getting submerged as a result of climate change. So we know that the environmental justice movement started to protest against the siting of these polluting industries, predominantly in racial minorities and poor communities. And of course, this continues, and there are many examples from around the world, unfortunately. And this impact, the disproportionate impact on poor and vulnerable, was recognized by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well. This was a 1.5 degrees report that was issued in 2018. So the report said equity has procedural and distributive dimensions and require fairness in burden sharing, both between generations and between and within nations, right? Because climate change is a generational issue as well. So this shows the percentage of CO2 emissions by world population, and you can see that 50% of the emissions, consumption emissions, are emitted by 10%, just 10% of the world population. Whereas the poorest 50% is responsible only for 10% of the emissions, consumption emissions. And if you look at the vulnerability, the situation is reversed, right? You can see the countries that are most vulnerable, Africa and Asia, and those countries emitted very little greenhouse gas emissions. So we come to mitigation measures. To address climate change, of course, states have pledged to take certain measures. And the problem is some of these measures also have an impact on adverse impact on certain communities. So the RED program, it stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, quite a mouthful. Of course, the idea here is that you have to protect forests, which is a great thing, right? But what has happened is, in order to make these RED ready, that's what it's called, many indigenous groups have been evicted from their traditional lands, right? So states have been, developing countries have been responsible for this violation. Of course, in theory, this is a win-win situation. Protecting forests is great. Forests act as a carbon sink, as we know, but the way it has been implemented has had a huge impact on indigenous peoples, right? Similarly, clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol also saw many rights violations. Several people died in Latin America actually protesting against some of these projects. So that's why it's important to apply a human rights framework, not just to the consequences of climate change, but also to the mitigation measures that states put in place, right? Bioenergy is another example where land has been converted into crops for to produce biofuels, land that could have cultivated food crops. So that has had an impact on food security of people as well. Similarly, I mentioned that we have to live through some of these consequences. In other words, we have to adapt to these consequences. So these adaptation measures that we put in place should also be evaluated for their human rights impact, right? At a minimum, these adaptation plans should be made with the participation of those who are likely to be affected, right? Incorporating local knowledge, etc. And we need to treat them as agents of change, not helpless victims. So this shows where the emissions are coming from. This is where we show that energy production, electricity, heat production, industry, other energy users, even transportation, agriculture obviously need energy, right? Without energy, we cannot survive. So as you can see, energy has a huge impact on climate change, right? Which means that we need to transition to sustainable sources of energy. Right now we use mainly fossil fuels, right? So options include wind, biomass, solar, hydro, nuclear, right? Ocean from energy waves, energy from ocean waves is also talked about, but not really used too much, I saw. So renewable sources of energy are increasingly getting traction, and we are using quite a bit now. So these are some of the options available, and some may be a bit controversial than others. And this shows the percentage, I don't know how up to, yeah, this is from 2022. How much we are using from other sources. So hydro, nuclear, as we know, is, some don't like it. So we know that we have to transition to sustainable sources of energy, but how we transition is also important, right? Because people will lose their jobs. So, you know, that's a violation of their rights. So how do we address that? So a just transition has been put forward as a framework to address this situation, how we transition from a fossil fuel intensive economy to a low carbon economy, right? So we have heard that you should develop first and think about the environment. After, if we sort of go do this transition, if we address climate change, it will have a huge impact on the economy. Of course, climate change itself has a huge impact on the economy. Not a lot of people are talking about it, right? And then transitioning to a low carbon economy will create new jobs, right? We need to train people for that. Of course, there will be some jobs that are lost, but then we are living through that as well in other areas, right? With computers and artificial intelligence and all these things. Some traditional jobs are being lost anyway, right? But when we talk about fossil fuels, because of the huge lobby and the amount of money they control, fossil fuel has, a climate change and transitioning to a low carbon economy has been attacked, saying that there will be a huge impact on the economy. Obviously, there will be an impact on the economy, but just imagine the cost of one severe weather event, one hurricane, the disruption it caused in the billions of dollars, right? Nobody's talking about that. So what we need to do is to ensure that the communities that are already suffering from climate change, from other issues, which are all intertwined, right, are not worse off, right? So in other words, we have to ensure that this transition is a fair one, just and equitable, right? So just transition, creating green jobs, but ensuring that we don't replicate the same problems we created with the fossil fuel economy. And unfortunately, there are signs that we are replicating the same mistakes. So the Just Transition Alliance has come up with some principles to address this, to put the focus on workers, communities, and indigenous peoples, saying they have a right to a clean and healthy environment. There's no contradiction among sustainable development, having a healthy economy and maintaining clean and safe environment. So we need action because these issues have no borders. We need action at local, regional, national, and global levels. We need solidarity. We need to pay attention to both frontline workers and fence line communities. So in other words, communities that are disproportionately affected by environmental injustices. The cost of achieving sustainable development, healthy economy, and clean environment should not be borne by current or future victims of environmental and economic injustices and unfair trade policies, right? And they have a right to challenge any entity, including governments and corporations, that commits economic and environmental injustices. So these principles are based on sustainable development, human rights, and justice principles. So as I mentioned, the global nature of climate change blurs the injustice within the global system. And the other issue that we have to remember is that the choices we make here have repercussions thousands of miles away and far into the future. right? So the decisions we make today, the impacts will be felt by children and grandchildren, right? So that's why it's important to take a longer term view of the decisions we make today, as well as the choices we make today. So this is the environmental justice framework. Of course, there's no one sort of accepted definition. There are components of this. So distributive justice is one of them, fair allocation of both burdens and benefits. What we do right now is the benefits are shared by a small segment of society, and we allocate the burdens to the poorer segment of society, right? Procedural justice requires open, informed, and inclusive decision-making processes. In other words, we need to get the people who are affected by a particular activity in the decision-making process, right? With regard to indigenous peoples, this requires free, prior, and informed consent, which is a higher level of participation connected to self-determination of this group, especially in situations where they are likely to be evicted from their traditional lands. The third component is corrective justice. So this is the obligation to pay compensation to victims or correct past wrongs. So this is where many of the major emitters have gone scot-free. Right? We haven't held any of the fossil fuel companies accountable for the injustice they have created. Right? In the meantime, they are continuing to amass trillions of dollars in profits by continuing to contribute to climate change. And for a while, they suppressed science as well, just like the tobacco companies. And social justice is the final component of this definition. And that argues that these environmental injustice struggles are intertwined with struggles for other forms of justice. Racial justice, economic justice, etc. So you have to look at all these injustices together if you are serious about addressing environmental injustice as well, right? It's not easy to do because, we have tried to address some of these injustices for a long time and haven't been too successful, unfortunately. This is another depiction of environmental justice, and it has added responsibility and capability, which is really nice. So increasing the capacity of these communities to cope with this. So this definition is from the US Environmental Protection Agency. The fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. So distributive justice and participatory justice, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, etc. Right? So according to the EPA, environmental justice is a way of looking at environmental issues through the lens of social inequality, right? And there's an example of an environmental injustice. So climate justice, this definition of climate justice is from the Mary Robinson Foundation. According to that, it links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, right? So this shows the interconnectedness of these different struggles. So climate justice is racial justice. That shows that climate change affects us the most, right? Minorities. So climate justice is informed by science, responds to science, and acknowledges the need to equitable stewardship of the world's resources. So the Paris Agreement that was adopted in 2015 was the first environmental treaty to refer to human rights. And that was in 2015, mind you, right? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration. It took the international community, I don't know how many years, you can do the math, to include human rights in an environmental treaty. This is the first time. And it also refers to climate justice. So this is what the Paris Agreement says. Of course, the wording has been diluted quite a bit. Parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, etc. And then with regard to environmental justice, it says, noting the importance for some, as if, very half-heartedly they have put in these measures, but nonetheless, it includes references to both climate justice and human rights, which became very controversial, actually, even in this form. And in 2021, the Human Rights Council actually adopted a resolution recognizing a right to a healthy environment as a human right. Again, this was the first time that the human rights community recognized a right to a healthy environment as a separate right. Earlier, what lawyers did was to use existing rights to articulate environmental rights. So this was a major step forward. And then it was followed by a UN General Assembly resolution in July 2022. And it said that a right to a healthy environment is related to other rights, and that requires the full implementation of multilateral environmental treaties. So in order to achieve a right to a healthy environment, we needed to implement multilateral environmental treaties. And interestingly, it called upon states as well as business enterprises to give effect to this right. So this is the first time that business enterprises were called upon to give effect to the right to a healthy environment. Oh, sorry, I forgot to finish that sentence. Although the resolution does not refer to either justice or equity, it recognizes the disproportionate impact on certain segments of society. So this is what the resolution said. The consequences are felt most acutely by women and girls and those segments of population that are already in vulnerable situations, including indigenous peoples and people with disabilities. President Biden adopted an executive order on environmental justice earlier this year on the eve of Earth Day, and said, defined environmental justice as just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, etc., but does not mention gender or women in the executive order. Although we know that women are disproportionately affected. Okay, to conclude, climate change is a complex problem, right? And sometimes it can seem overwhelming because every sector of the economy is contributing to the problem. So a global and a truly collective action problem, but as we discussed, certain communities and countries who contributed least to the problem are disproportionately affected, right? Sorry about the typo there. Vulnerability of certain groups must be recognized, but we need to treat them as agents of change, not just victims. Unfortunately, we are fast approaching tipping points beyond which no return will be possible. And according to the recent report by scientists, we need to go carbon neutral by 2034. Climate change affects almost all human rights. So when we talk about climate change, adopting a rights-based approach is necessary. Holding major emitters accountable is also necessary. We need to transition to a low carbon economy, but this transition must be just, right? We need to ensure that the impact on frontline workers and fence line communities are included in all policies. We have to address the global inequity and root causes. And a lot of countries argue that this is a global problem, so individually they cannot do much. And the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child very clearly said the global nature does not absolve our individual responsibility to address climate change. And we must treat this as an emergency. We created this problem, right? Human beings. So we should be able to solve it. And we owe it to our children and grandchildren to do so. Thank you so much. Questions? Yeah.
What would you say to people? What would you say to people who are concerned that it's the use of energy which has raised standards of living, right? And that in developing countries, if they don't have access to inexpensive energy, they're going to stay in poverty. What do you say to those who would say it's unfair to those developing communities not to give them access to inexpensive energy?
Oh, I'm not saying we shouldn't give them access, right? I think we in the global north bears a huge responsibility for creating this problem. As I said, the US is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. So because billions of people are still living in poverty, many don't have access to running water and electricity, right? I come from a developing country myself, right? I did have electricity and water, but many don't, right? So how do we address that unjust situation? The only way, because the resources are finite, right? That's why I said we have to pay attention to the decisions we made today, right? Our consumption, a lot of people don't want to talk about this. Our consumption has to come down if we are serious about improving the lives of billions of people in the developing countries. That is the only, I'm not an economist. In fact, we had the chief economist of the World Bank here last week. And he said, we have to have consumption. That's the only way that the economy goes. With all due respect, I think that's how we got to, right? I'm not saying we have to give up everything and go back to the dark ages. No, but do we really need the latest iPhone and this and that? And electronic waste is a huge problem. It's adding to climate change and every other, to health problems as well, because many of these workers, many electronic waste goes to China and other parts of the world. And, these people try to get whatever they can from to sell basically. And it's very hazardous, right? So yeah, I'm not arguing that developing countries should stay where they are. We have to increase, their standard of living, improve the standard of living. But the only way to do that, as far as I can see, is to reduce our level of consumption here. Yeah.
Is there anything in law that requires addressing this problem? In the sense that through the courts, you can force either businesses or even governmental bodies to do this in this country or in other countries.
Other countries have been more forthcoming through their courts than in this country. There are some cases here too, and recently there was one case in Montana where children were successful in.
They haven't been successful yet, and so that's.
Well, the court said they have a right to a healthy environment, right? But there was a case before the Human Rights Committee. Again, it's not a court as such, but it has quasi-judicial functions, where Australia was asked to pay compensation to an indigenous community for not helping them with adaptation programs, pay compensation for the damage they are suffering as a result of climate change. So some cases are coming up, but we are fighting against a system, a legal system that has never seen something as complex as climate change. So some of the legal principles are very archaic, not just at the national level, but at the international level too. Because many of these issues are very, many of the legal principles that evolved deal with bilateral issues, not something as complex as climate change, where everybody is contributing to the problem and everybody is a victim at the same time. So we have to rethink some of the legal principles as well.
Is that something that's being studied now? Is that a topic of hot conversation in law schools?
I wish it were. I have been trying to get our law school, at least, to incorporate climate change into everything we are teaching, because many of the existing principles will be affected by climate change. Not just principles, many of the subjects, courses we are teaching, like property law, insurance, tax, con law, right? Change is hard, unfortunately, but
Yeah, like what happens when property disappears?
exactly, exactly
Who
my
owns
point.
who owns it under the water?
Right, exactly my point. But we are not doing enough to train lawyers, law students to address that situation. I think all law schools should be teaching climate change in everything we do.
Got a question online.
Okay.
And Naska asks, what can the little vulnerable guy or gal, especially gal, do to mitigate climate change and these injustice crises? So I think coming from the perspective of someone who is disproportionately vulnerable and affected, what can they do?
Yeah, getting together, I think social movements are important. It'll be really hard to sort of work on something as complex and political. Unfortunately, climate change has become a very political issue. It's like COVID, if you wore a mask during COVID, it became a political statement, right? Not a health issue, unfortunately. So I think we need to have strength in numbers. Get together with like-minded people and try and lobby for change. I mean, unfortunately, the window of opportunity is closing. And we don't know what a 2-degree world will look like. We are already experiencing this level of consequences with a 1.1 degree increase in temperature. That's it, right? So imagine what a 2-degree or even a 3-degree increase will look like. So I know change is hard, but ultimately we may not really have a choice. And then it might be too late. By the time we get our act together, the consequences will be way beyond any repairing. Yeah.
Kind of along the lines of reduced consumption. Do you think a low carbon economy that is necessary to meet some of these goals would involve something like degrowth? And what would be the impacts of that to your point?
Yeah. So when degrowth was first articulated, I was against it because they did not make a distinction between developing countries and developed countries. But now it has sort of evolved to say that, it applies to major economies, to the global north mainly. So, I mean, in a way, it's the same as less consumption, right? But I know it's not politically very palatable. And when we talk about degrowth, a lot of people think that we are going back to the dark ages kind of thing. I mean, sure, I mean, in a place like this, we do need energy. We need to heat our houses, right? But at the same time, somebody in a poor village in my country, in Sri Lanka, for example, they do need electricity, right? So how do we provide for that without reducing our consumption? Because everything is connected, right? So yeah, I mean, degrowth might be the only way in the long run. We'll have to ask the economists how that will play out. But yeah.
We didn't touch much about the discrepancies between political beliefs or different countries and how there are clearly differences in beliefs of the concern for this. Is there any focus, a group that's focusing on how to lessen these discrepancies and create it more of a global issue? I mean, obviously everybody in this room and everybody we're talking to understands the importance of it, but is there like a focus group or a group of people that are working on trying to bridge these discrepancies? Because it's obviously an important factor in moving forward.
Yeah, there are lots of groups actually, lots of different groups across the world. There are lots of youth groups because they feel that obviously it's their future, right? The current day decision makers will be long dead and gone by the time the worst consequences take place, right? So you can see them very active at climate conferences, for example. And that's why they're exploring every avenue to get some major changes. But I feel that actually there was another slide that I didn't include in this. There was a news article a couple of years ago which said billionaires are the major cause of climate change, right? These fossil fuel companies. And how do we get them to change? Right? I mean, especially in this country, they're a huge lobby, right? But I think awareness raising, education, I think climate change should be taught at every level, in every school, every university. Because we really need to understand the gravity of the problem. But unless we get our politicians to pay attention, I don't know how we can make the necessary changes we need. The only positive thing I will say there is if industry itself pressurize the politicians to do the change, because, it makes sense for them economically to do this transition before everybody else does, right? Because we know that we have to do it at some point, so might as well get in the game sooner rather than later. And this is what happened with the ozone issue, actually. Industry got together and said, asked for regulation from states at the international level, saying, we have to face this out anyway. So we will come up with substitutes for ozone-depleting substances, but we want to make sure that there's regulation to do so. We don't want to be at a disadvantage. So give us some regulation. So I think getting industry on board would be really necessary. With climate change, of course, it's a much more complex issue. It happened the other way around. Industry lobbied government not to come up with regulation because it will be bad for the economy, right? So there are lots of groups working on this at different levels, but getting changes at the top level is hard.
I might add I think it's the Yale Climate Communications Research Group. They do the 6 Americas of alarm, concern, dismissive, doubtful, and they track, over time how people in the US at least, view climate change. And there's definitely more shifting to alarm and concern. And so I think they're seeing, trending overall, the majority of it now are kind of on the side of alarm and concern.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question, then we'll wrap up here online here. What, in your view, can energy researchers do to best ensure human rights violations are not exacerbated with the clean energy transition?
Yeah, so some of the things that are happening, I mentioned that some of the same mistakes are being replicated in relation to clean energy. Some of the wind energy farms are being sited on indigenous land, unfortunately. So we have to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that we did with fossil fuel.
Well, through procedural justice as an example, involving them in the
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think the most important thing is corrective justice. Because up to now, we haven't really done anything to compensate these communities for the injustices they have suffered, right? So, yeah.
All right. I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much again for your presentation.
Thank you for having me.